And now we're learning his ex-wife, Asa Ellerup, heard his confession prior to his plea.
He looked very nervous, very, very nervous. And I said to him, "So, Mr. Heuermann, I understand that you are confessing to me on these murders. Can you please tell me how many of these women did you kill?" He said 8.
She sat across from him in a jail visiting room. Her ex-husband. The man she shared a bed with for decades. The man who raised their children in that house. She asked him directly, "How many women did you kill?" He said 8. And then he told her something that should make every single person watching this stop cold. He told her that 7 of those 8 women were killed in the basement of their family home, in Massapequa Park, the same house where their children grew up, where birthdays happened, where neighbors waved from the driveway. Asa Ellerup has since divorced Rex Heuermann, but she still lives there and can't move out because they don't have the resources to do so yet. What would you have done if you were Asa? Drop your take in the comments, because by the time this is over, you're going to understand 10 things about Rex Heuermann's life that most coverage has never fully connected. Not the surface level stuff. The architecture of what was hidden inside an ordinary suburban life for over 30 years. And the deeper you go into this case, the more one question follows you. How does something this dark stay invisible for that long? Let's start not where most people start, but where this case actually starts. December 2010. A Suffolk County police officer is running a canine training exercise along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach. His dog stops. There are human remains in the brush, wrapped in burlap, bound by a belt. The victim is Melissa Barthelemy, 24 years old. She graduated cosmetology school in Buffalo, moved to New York to build something, and ended up working escort ads on Craigslist from a basement apartment in the Bronx. She disappeared in July 2009, over a year before her body was found. Within days, investigators find 3 more sets of remains in the same stretch of brush.
From there, the investigation consisted of over 300 subpoenas, search warrants, and other legal processes to obtain evidence. Investigators say updated technology allowed them to test hair samples that were originally degraded in a degraded condition on the victims. And they found they then followed him as well to get abandoned DNA samples. And
Megan Waterman, 22. Maureen Brainard-Barnes, 25. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, all young women, all found within a mile of each other, all wrapped and bound in the same way. They became known as the Gilgo Four. The method is too consistent to be coincidence, and as the search expands across Long Island over the following months, more remains surface, different years, different locations, but the same burlap, the same highway, the same deliberate concealment. Whatever or whoever left these women here had not just done this once. But here's what almost no one talks about. When investigators started asking when this actually began, the answer they eventually got back was so much older than anyone expected, it changed the shape of the entire case. Sandra Costilla was 28 years old when she was killed in November 1993. Her remains weren't found at Gilgo Beach. They were found in a wooded area in North Sea, Southampton, a completely different part of Long Island. For decades, her case wasn't even connected to the Gilgo murders. It existed in a separate file, a separate tragedy. When prosecutors charged Rex Heuermann with her murder in June 2024, it didn't just add another count to an indictment. It moved the starting line of this case back by 14 years. Heuermann was 30 years old in 1993. He had been living in Massapequa Park his entire life. He had just purchased a house there from his own mother the following year, 105 First Avenue, the same house he grew up in, the same house he would live in for the next 3 decades, the same house where he would eventually confess to killing 7 women. 34 years passed between Sandra Costilla's death and the charge against him. And that single fact opens something uncomfortable. Because if the timeline reaches back to 1993, and some of his victims' remains weren't linked to him for decades, then the question of where this truly begins and whether every victim has even been identified is still not fully closed. But that house, the one he bought from his mother, the one his family called home, what was actually inside it? Subscribe to this channel right now, because we cover cases like this every single week. The details that don't make headlines, the patterns that only become visible when you slow down and actually look. It takes 2 seconds. Hit subscribe. When investigators executed their first search warrant on 105 First Avenue in July 2023, it took 12 days to get through the property. They needed multiple trucks to remove the material. What came out of that house reads like a list that makes no sense coming from a family home. 58 hard drives, 27 computers, 46 cell phones, 16 cameras, 9 Wi-Fi routers, 17 tablets, 42 USB drives, 8 laptops, 50 hotel key cards, and 4 GPS devices. The house itself had been described for years as deteriorating, heavily cluttered. Neighbors called it an eyesore. It is 1,343 square feet, small for a family. Smaller still when you start to understand what investigators believe was happening in the basement. Because it wasn't until forensic teams went back into that basement after a discovery on one of those 58 hard drives that the full picture of what that space was used for started to come into focus. They scanned the basement paneling with infrared light. They found evidence of adhesive on the walls, consistent with drop cloths being hung from the ceiling. And they found push pins embedded into the drop ceiling above. Both of those details came directly from a document recovered on Heuermann's own computer. A document he had deleted. A document forensic investigators pulled back from the deleted space of the hard drive anyway. It was a Microsoft Word file, created in 2000, last modified between 2001 and 2002. Prosecutors called it a planning document, a blueprint. It was organized into sections, labeled in all caps. Supplies listed cutting tools, acid, hairnets, and tarps. Body prep included the instruction to remove the head and hands, which is consistent with the condition in which the remains of Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack were found. Things to remember contained a single entry: sound travels. Prosecutors believe that note indicates the killings happened indoors, in that basement, behind drop cloths hung with push pins from the ceiling. There were notes on what to do differently next time. Hit harder. Consider a hit to the face or neck for takedown. Use heavier rope because a previous rope had broken under stress. He was improving his process. Between murders, in a Word document, saved to a hard drive, in the same house where his children were growing up. And then there was one entry that investigators have described as particularly disturbing. A note on the importance of sleep, not just to avoid problems, but to increase what the document referred to as playtime. Prosecutors believe that phrase describes what happened to the victims in that basement. Now, while all of this existed on a computer in Massapequa Park, while that document sat on a hard drive inside a cluttered, deteriorating house on a Long Island street, Rex Heuermann drove to Manhattan every morning and went to work. And you need to understand what that looked like from the outside, because it is the part that makes this case almost impossible to process. He ran an architectural consulting firm called RH Consultants and Associates, located on Fifth Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. He had a professional reputation. Colleagues described him as organized, knowledgeable, friendly. One woman who knew him through weekly networking meetings found out about his arrest while she was preparing to speak with him again. She said she had just seen him on a Zoom call the day before. She said she did not see this coming. 30 years of this. And not one person in his professional world saw it. Investigators have noted that his training as an architect, someone who thinks structurally, who plans for load tolerances and failure points, who assesses vulnerabilities in systems, appears to have translated directly into the way he planned and avoided detection. He knew how to build something that wouldn't collapse. He also knew, it appears, how to study the people trying to bring it down. Because when investigators searched that house, among everything they removed, they found a book. Written by John Douglas, the retired FBI agent who built the Behavioral Science Unit, the man whose career became the basis for Mindhunter. The book is called The Cases That Haunt Us. Rex Heuermann owned it. Whether he was reading it to understand how investigators think or for something else entirely is something prosecutors have not stated directly. But the planning document reflects a specific awareness of what leaves evidence, what gets traced, what gets killers caught. He was not operating blind. He was operating informed. And that makes the next detail even harder to sit with. After Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009, her 15-year-old sister Amanda started getting phone calls. Not from Melissa, from someone claiming to describe what had been done to her. For 5 consecutive weeks, a male caller contacted Amanda, specifically Amanda, not her mother, and described the killing in graphic detail. Every call was under 3 minutes. Every call came from a crowded location in Midtown Manhattan. And every single call was timed to avoid being traced. When investigators reviewed phone records years later, they found something that closed every possible alternative explanation. Rex Heuermann's personal cell phone was in the same location as the burner phone, making those calls every single time. Not almost every time. Every time. Investigators reviewed every communication event across all the relevant phone records and found not one instance where Heuermann's personal phone was in a separate location from the burner phone when those calls were placed. He called her grieving teenage sister. Repeatedly. Deliberately. For over a month. After Maureen Brainard-Barnes disappeared, someone also used her phone to check her voicemail. That activity overlapped with Heuermann's location data as well. A forensic psychiatrist described this behavior as an extension of control, continuing the experience beyond the act itself. Psychological torture, delayed and repeated. But there was something else investigators found on those burner phones that most coverage has largely skipped past. The burner phones hadn't only been used to contact victims. They had been used to conduct thousands of searches for sadistic and torture-related material, but also repeated and specific searches for the Gilgo Beach investigation itself, for the victims by name, for updates in the case, for news coverage. He was monitoring everything, watching how close investigators were getting. And prosecutors found, in records tied to one of his accounts, evidence that he had searched for images of the victims' family members, their sisters, their children. He was watching the people left behind, which makes the question of how he was never flagged sooner never surfaced by any of those searches, never caught on any of those phones, one of the most unsettling parts of this entire case. And the answer has everything to do with a green truck, a roommate's memory, and 13 years of a detail sitting in a file. When Lynn Costello disappeared in 2010, her roommate told investigators what she remembered about the client who picked Amber up. A large man, dark-colored pickup truck. She specifically recalled that the truck had a triangular brace between the cab and the bed. That is not a common feature. It is distinctive to a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. That detail sat untouched for over a decade. When the Gilgo Beach Task Force was created in 2022, one investigator pulled that old description and began cross-referencing vehicle registration records on Long Island. Rex Heuermann owned a Chevrolet Avalanche, registered in Massapequa Park. From that single match, the entire investigation pivoted. Subpoenas were issued. Cell tower records were pulled. Behavioral patterns were mapped. Surveillance began. And within 6 weeks of the task force focusing on Heuermann, they had enough to move toward a DNA confirmation. Which brings us to the pizza. By early 2023, investigators had built a significant circumstantial case cell tower data, vehicle records, digital overlap across years of burner phone activity. But what they needed was physical DNA. Getting a sample without a court order requires finding something the subject voluntarily discards. On the 26th of January 2023, a surveillance team followed Heuermann as he left his office on Fifth Avenue and watched him throw a pizza box into a public trash can on the sidewalk. They retrieved it. The crust went to the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. The DNA from that pizza was compared to a male hair found at the base of the burlap used to restrain Megan Waterman's body. A hair that had been sitting in evidence for years, waiting for technology to catch up. It matched.
Crime scene investigators worked late into the night and in the rain, digging into what emerged as a sandy graveyard. Body parts found, a yellow marker on each grisly find.
Suffolk's new police commissioner bringing transparency and he hopes new leads in a notorious crime spree that stumped police for a dozen years.
Of course, we've all been covering this case through the years. I've been on it many times, and I have to tell you what's truly amazing about this arrest is if you look at the statistics, serial killers often do not get caught. We've heard through the reporting tonight that they're generally better educated, but they're one or two steps ahead of the police, and their crimes go over decades, which means that some of the materials we have now, that police and law enforcement have now, were not available back then. Only now they're taking the steps that are really the keys to take back cases like this.
30 years, hundreds of investigative dead ends, and it ended with a piece of leftover pizza on a Manhattan sidewalk. A surveillance photo taken that day, captured by a street-level camera at a nearby store, shows Heuermann walking normally down Fifth Avenue. The trash can where he threw the box is visible in the frame. He had no idea anyone was watching. But the DNA match only told part of the story, because there was another set of DNA found on those victims that no one expected, and when investigators understood what it meant, it told them something about what was happening inside that house that was almost worse than everything else. When hair samples were pulled from the remains of Megan Waterman, Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainard-Barnes, some of the hair was female, but it didn't belong to any of the victims. DNA testing matched those hairs to Asa Ellerup Rex, Heuermann's wife, and to his daughter, Victoria. Prosecutors' theory: the victims had been inside the house. Their bodies had come into contact with surfaces saturated with the DNA of the people who lived there. Hair from Asa's daily life, from the floors, the fabric, the surfaces of a home she moved through every day, had transferred onto the bodies of women brought into that basement without her knowledge. Asa Ellerup's attorney has stated she had no involvement of any kind in these crimes. But Heuermann told Asa directly, according to his own confession, that he acted when she and the children were away. Court records confirm this. In at least one case, Jessica Taylor's murder in 2003, phone and travel records show that Asa and the children were out of town that weekend. He tracked their schedule. He waited for the house to be his alone, and then he used it. Her DNA ended up on the victims not because of anything she did, but because her home was used as a crime scene without her ever knowing. She has been living there ever since. Let that settle for a second. Because now think about this from the perspective of everyone around him during those 30 years. Colleagues, neighbors, his own family. Not one person detected it. And Rex Heuermann understood exactly why. Investigators and behavioral experts have pointed to what they call compartmentalization, at a scale rarely seen the ability to maintain completely separate psychological and behavioral modes without either one bleeding into the other. Professional architect by day, family man at home, and whatever was happening in that basement when the house was empty, the FBI has entered a formal agreement to interview Heuermann at length as part of his plea deal. The Behavioral Analysis Unit will cover his entire life, from childhood to arrest, to understand how this structure was built and maintained. A former FBI profiler commenting on the case noted that Asa Ellerup is likely asking herself questions she may never fully answer. How did she miss it? Whether he ever thought about her differently? What the house she is still living in actually contains? Those questions bring us to the courtroom. The 8th of April 2026. Exactly 1,000 days after his arrest, Rex Heuermann walked into Suffolk County Supreme Court in Riverhead and pleaded guilty to 7 murders.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, Mr. Brown. As I was beginning to say, it is the understanding of the District Attorney's Office that the defendant will plead guilty to 7 counts in the indictment, specifically counts 1 through 3 and counts 7 through 10. Counts 4 through 6 will be dismissed in satisfaction at the time of the defendant's sentencing. In addition to allocuting to and admitting his factual guilt to all elements of counts 1 through 3 and 7 through 10 of the indictment, the defendant further agrees that although he has not been charged with this crime, he will admit as part of his plea that he intentionally caused the death of Karen Vergata and transported and left her remains in Suffolk County in 1996. The District Attorney's Office agrees that in exchange for the defendant pleading guilty to counts 1 through 3 and counts 7 through 10 of the indictment and admitting to the uncharged murder of Karen Vergata, the District Attorney's Office recommends the following sentence. Counts 1 through 3, murder in the first degree, the maximum sentence of life imprisonment without parole to run consecutive to each other. Counts 7 through 10, the maximum sentence of 25 years for life imprisonment to run consecutive to one another, and with the sentences on counts 1 through 3. To summarize the foregoing sentence, the defendant agrees to serve 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole regarding counts 1 through 3, followed by 4 consecutive sentences of 25 years imprisonment to life to run consecutive to one another. Should the defendant allocute to the murder of Karen Vergata, the defendant's guilty plea and this plea agreement will satisfy and cover the uncharged homicide of Karen Vergata. In exchange for all of the above pleas, there will be no further prosecutions pertaining to the murders of the aforementioned 8 victims: Karen Vergata, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. The defendant will acknowledge both orally and in writing that he has received voluminous and sufficient discovery to make an informed decision regarding his plea here today. The defendant will further waive any objections to the District Attorney's compliance with Article 245 of the Criminal Procedure Law. The defendant has also agreed to withdraw all motions currently pending before this court. As set forth in the written waiver of right to appeal, the defendant agrees to waive his right to appeal, which includes the court's prior hearing determination, as well as any claim that the sentence imposed by this court is excessive. The defendant further acknowledges that he has been fully apprised by his attorneys of the rights and privileges that he is waiving, and that his waiver is being agreed to knowingly and voluntarily and made for the purpose of receiving the benefit of not being charged with the murder of Karen Vergata or any other charges related to the deaths of Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, and Sandra Costilla. Finally, counts 4, 5, and 6 will be dismissed in satisfaction at the time of sentencing.
He also admitted to an 8th Karen Vergata, who disappeared in 1996 and had never been formally charged to him. He said he strangled all 8 women. He said he used burner phones to contact them. He said he lured each of them with the promise of money. He confirmed the burlap. He confirmed the dump sites. The families were in that courtroom. They wept as he answered the prosecutor's questions one by one, methodically, without visible emotion. Megan Waterman's daughter, Liliana, who was a small child when her mother disappeared, said hearing him admitted in court lifted a weight she had carried her entire life. Then she said she still has questions. Why her mother? What happened? Where all of it took place? Those answers are not part of the deal. Under the plea agreement, Heuermann will not be providing additional details at sentencing. No explanation of what happened in that basement. No account of why each woman was chosen. Nothing that would fill the specific silences the families are still living inside. His defense attorney described the decision to plead as cathartic for Heuermann, a relief. Sentencing is scheduled for the 17th of June 2026. He will spend the rest of his life in prison. But even with a guilty plea, even with 8 victims named and accounted for, the case does not feel closed to the people closest to it. The district attorney has said publicly that the task force is not stopping. They are reviewing other unsolved cases along the same highway corridor, looking for Heuermann's methods, the burlap, the geographic patterns, the particular way remains were positioned and concealed. There is also the matter of who else may be out there. Sandra Costilla's murder wasn't linked to this case for over 3 decades. Valerie Mack wasn't even identified until 2020. Tanya Jackson and her 2-year-old daughter Tatiana, whose remains were found near Gilgo Beach in 2011, weren't identified until April 2025. That is the timeline of this case. Decades of unknowing. Bodies found in pieces. Children identified 14 years after they were taken. And Rex Heuermann was at his desk in Manhattan through all of it. If you've made it this far, drop a comment. What detail in this case hit you the hardest? Because for a lot of people it's different things. The basement. The phone calls to Amanda. The planning document that he deleted but couldn't fully erase. The DNA from a wife who never knew. The pizza crust. Every one of those details is part of the same question that this case keeps forcing back to the surface. Not just how did he do this, but how did something this structured, this deliberate, this long stay invisible inside an ordinary life for over 30 years? Because if the answer to that question is simply that he was careful, then that's the part that should keep you thinking long after this video ends.